production and war spending is what get us out of the Great Depression. Next, we have rationing, okay? This is something that's really interesting, okay? Every head of household would get a ration book. Think of it as like a coupon book, okay? But this is not a deal. Guys, make sure we need to be paying attention, okay? This was like a right to buy, okay? This was not like, you would get it for a month, okay? So this is the ration book for a month. And it would say, 1 carton of egg this week, 1 carton of egg this week, 1 carton of egg this week, and then like 4 gallons of milk total, 4 loaves of bread total. Do you get what I'm saying? And if I'm going to check out, the cashier would say, okay, give me your ration. And let's say I used all my milk rations. Can I buy that milk? No. And the purpose of the rationing, so again, World War I, we volunteered not to ration, okay, or not to, overindulge, okay? But World War II, the government is forcing you. There's a difference. One's volunteer, that's World War I. During World War II, it's, no, if you don't have your ration card, you cannot buy, okay? And the purpose was we need to go with little, right? So who can go with enough? Our soldiers fighting for us, defending democracy. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, rationing. This was something the government mandated it, and the purpose was to limit resources to make sure our soldiers have enough. Okay, another thing, victory gardens. Okay, a lot of people grew, and I know now it's kind of coming back, especially during the pandemic. I felt a lot of people had their own little garden. Okay, but it was really popular back then to have your own garden in your front lawn, even. Because the stuff you made meant that you didn't have to go to the store and take away from the soldiers' food, okay? Now let's talk about new roles for minorities. I do love this photo. Do you see how it's a white male and an African-American male? They're actually making a plane. They're working together, and it says, united we can, okay? So just like with women, a lot of African-American males got a new job opportunity too up north, just like in the Great Migration. It's like Great Migration Part 2. Okay. However, there is going to be discrimination. Okay. People will still get paid less based off your race. Okay. And in some places, okay, in some factories, you will have some racist factory owners, and they are going to refuse to hire someone. And when someone says, why didn't I get the job? They said, because of your race. Would that fly today? Oh no, you'd be sued. Not okay. Okay. There is a guy named A. Philip Randolph who calls out these people, okay? Now, remember I told you, only what kind of stuff can be produced during World War II in the factories? Yeah, only war stuff, okay? Do y'all know, so do you know that Ford wasn't paying his workers because he had to stop building his Model T, Z, whatever it is, okay? The government would give money to Ford, and then that money would go to pay the workers. So do you see, is Ford having to spend a penny? No, the government, because again, the government's saying, look, you can't make what you normally make, so we're going to take over and tell you what to make, but we'll pay you. So it's kind of, okay, that's fine temporarily. But what if you had a factory owner, and let's just, let's say that this factory owner was a racist factory owner. Okay? This looks bad. Because look, the federal government is going to give a racist factory owner money. Anytime the government gives somebody money, you got to follow the rules, right? And so the government is basically A. Philip Randolph, this very educated African-American male. He argues that this is illegal. This should be unconstitutional, that the federal government is giving money to someone who happens to be a racist and who is denying African-American jobs because of their race. So he threatens to lead a march on Washington. And who's the president at this time? FDR. And see, FDR, I don't even know if he was aware of what this was going on. And he said, yeah, this isn't right. And again, the guy's name is A. Philip Randolph. And he threatens to lead a march on Washington to bring this issue to light, this discrimination in the workforce, okay? And he doesn't have to do the march on Washington. Why? FDR gives in beforehand. And he basically says, look, this is what FDR says now, thanks to A. Philip Randolph. If a factory is receiving government money, you cannot deny someone a job based off their race. See progress? Okay, so did we have to do a march on Washington? No. The March on Washington, that's 1963. But what's cool is A. Philip Randolph. There are about 5 people who planned the March on Washington. One was MLK. Okay, if you ever look at a picture of the planners of the March on Washington in 1963, the older one is A. Philip Randolph. So while he didn't have to lead a March on Washington in the 40s, he'll lead one in the 1960s. So that's kind of cool. Okay. And then the last thing we got to talk about are Japanese Americans. Okay. Now we know what ends American neutrality, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a naval base. Okay. So basically, the Germans and the Italians are our enemy as well, they're the immigrants. But the number one enemy will be the Japanese Americans. Okay? Most of them were born in America. They were referred to as Nisei, like in the Japanese culture, meaning they're born in America. Maybe their parents or grandparents were from Japan, but they're born American. Like they might look like they're from Japan, but they were born in America. That makes them equal to me, right? Okay? But during this times of war, they're considered a national threat. Okay? And this is one of those things. There's the good and the bad and the ugly in U.S. history. This is the ugly. Okay? FDR, and to protect the nation's security, will issue an executive order 9066. And it basically says the Japanese, anyone of Japanese descent, will have to be sent and moved to an internment camp where these people were watched for the rest of the World War II. Okay? And again, I told you, it was like overnight. The military was like, we're rounding you up. They had to basically sell. And y'all know, like if a business is going out of business and let's say it's the last day before the business closed, that's when everyone shows up and they're like, oh, you said $1, you need 5 cents, right? Because they know that you're about to close your doors for good. Okay? So they really didn't get that much. This is definitely an example of during times of war, our civil liberties were not protected. Okay? Now, what did I tell you yesterday? How do we try to make it right later? Y'all remember? Reagan will issue a formal apology, and the federal government will give each Japanese who was interred, who's still alive, or their families, if that person wasn't alive, 20 grand. And again, is that enough? No. But sometimes when you just say you're sorry and you try to make up for it, means the world. Okay, but that's one of those oops in American history. And there is a guy named Korematsu. Do you remember what I told you what his first name was? Yeah, Fred. So when you see this, you think, okay, Japanese. But then when you hear his first name, you're like, oh, Fred. Okay? Fred Korematsu said, I don't think this executive order is legal. I mean, we have property rights. We have due process, 5th Amendment. We're citizens, 14th Amendment. All these amendments to protect them. And what does the Supreme Court say? Your kind of people bombed us. That means your kind of people are a national threat. So you still got to go. Okay? So you'll see some things are great for people in World War II in America. Some things are bad for people in America during World War II. Any questions there? Okay. Now, let's see. You have a note thing. If you want to just take some notes, you can. That's fine. But it should be the page after or before the Homefront. And the good news is that almost we've talked about 4 boxes already, so we're really not writing too much here. Okay? But we know major events of World War II in terms of America. Okay, what gets us involved? What attack? The attack on Pearl Harbor. Good. Okay. Now, what people do not realize, okay, is that there were, in terms of American fighting, there were two main theaters. Okay. You have the European theater, which that's where we're going to really try to fight, like Hitler is the enemy. Okay. And then you'll have the Pacific theater, which Japan is the enemy there. Okay. Now, the idea is if we first go after Europe, okay, and we get those objectives done, then Europe might be out of the picture, and then eventually we can focus more on Japan. That was the plan. Okay, so like if we want to defeat Japan, we've got to defeat Hitler first. Okay, so you will see there's lots of things happening at different times. Okay, I'll go ahead and tell you this: the turning point for the war doesn't happen until 1944 over here. Okay, we are over in the Pacific Ocean, but nothing, we're there for much longer than we are over here. The turning point here is in 1942. Okay, so I want to focus on this for a second. Okay, so we're over here, and in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there is an island called Midway Island. We actually got this in the late 1800s, around the same time we got Hawaii. Okay, and it's called Midway because it's basically the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In case you don't know, like I flew to Hawaii once. It was nonstop 10 to 12 hour flight. Okay, people do not realize how big the Pacific Ocean is. Okay, so if you're like a battleship, you might run out of gasoline or oil. Okay, this was a very strategic location because if you were low on oil or something, the fact that we owned Midway was great because it was in the middle, so you could like refuel if you needed to. Okay, well, what's going to happen is that we will lose it early on. The Japanese, they take over Guam. They take over the Philippines, which we own. Okay, but not right now because Japanese took it over. Okay, Japan also takes over Midway. Okay, we are losing. We're playing defense and we are losing. Looks like I was dancing right there. Promise. I promise I was not. That was really woo. But we are playing defense and we are losing. Okay, Midway is when we change it up and we actually are the offensive and we take over, starting with Midway. Yes, Alex.
All but one of their
aircraft carriers. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been fortunate. I went to San Diego a couple times, and there's actually the USS Midway that's there. It wasn't at Midway, but it's named after that battle. And they actually have an awesome, like 3D little video about that, about the aircraft carriers and stuff. And so what's going to happen is, so from like, let's say December 1941, January, we're basically losing islands and territories. Okay, but starting with the Battle of Midway in 1942, we start to gain islands. And instead of us playing defense, we're now on the attack. And yes, it's because we really annihilated a lot of the Japanese aircraft carriers there. Okay, so just make sure you know there. But again, one thing in the culture with the Japanese, you don't surrender. Okay, if you surrender, you will. Yeah, it is worse than death. It's like you will, like their culture and their religion is like you will not. I guess the equivalent of like going to heaven. Like it will be worse. Okay, so just know after Midway, we will do a strategy called island hopping. It's probably just an alarm. Yeah, looks like we just got out of the car.
Wasn't island hopping just pretty much you make a small couple times?
On a small scale, yes. Yeah, and again, there's a lot of Japanese islands, a lot of them, and some of them were ours, and we got to recover them. Okay, so what island hopping means is we're going to pick and choose different islands. Like the idea of like pick your battles was like pick your islands. Oh, we're gonna go into Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where those Japanese are hiding little holes, ready to get. We're gonna like go to the ones that don't have as many Japanese on there. Take those, and then we can focus more and more on the heavily fortified ones. So we go hop to this easy one, claim it. Hop to this easy one, claim it, and you'll see Later is when we go to Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where it's like really, really tough. And those Japanese are really not going to surrender. Okay? So just remember that. Okay? Now over here on the European theater. Remember I told you, starting in like 1940, you know, the Netherlands, France, all of basically Western Europe, except England, fell to the Nazis, right? Okay? The reason why D-Day is considered the turning point is because this is day one of us. The word is liberating, which remember that's like the liberator, remember that? That means freeing of Western Europe, okay? What I try to think about is like in France, where the Arc de Triomphe is, and the Eiffel Tower, you had huge Nazi flags hanging, okay? This is day one of not just liberating France. This is day one of liberating all of Western Europe, starting with France. A lot of people get that wrong with D-Day, because it was just liberating France, okay, yippee skippy, right? But we're talking about liberating all of Western Europe, starting with France, okay? Do we attack Paris? No. Where do we go? It's the northern part of France. Do y'all know? The beaches of anyone? Normandy. Okay. And when I say beaches, we're not talking about Panama City Beach. Okay. I've been there twice. Okay. We're talking high cliffs. So like heavy wind. It's one of those places where it rains a lot all year round. So imagine the waves. Imagine there's not really sand, it's sharp rocks that make up, that's like pebbles, that's the sand, okay? And again, there's these really high cliffs, okay? So it's really rainy, really watery, really choppy waves, okay? Harsh conditions. And they invaded there, okay? Exactly. And it's what's really great, what's really cool there, I mean, not cool, but like, you know, a lot of Americans, and there were Canadians who were there fighting, and also English. A lot of them did die. But what's cool is there were a lot of American soldiers. But the French government actually took the land where the cliffs are above and said, look, this is American soil. And make this a cemetery for those brave Americans who really dedicated. So it's kind of eerie, but special too, because again, it's like welcome to America, like it says that, okay? And like you're looking at all these white crosses and tombstones from these soldiers who died at Normandy, D-Day, and like you can hear and feel the waves. You know what I'm saying? Like the breeze and stuff. It's very, very, you know, just makes you realize that. And so that's June 6, 1944, okay? By August, France is liberated, okay? That's not long at all, and it keeps on going up, okay? Now, who is the guy on the European theater who is the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces? He's the head general for all the Allies, and he plans D-Day. He is the English Prime Minister. This guy's, I know you've heard of him, Dwight Eisenhower. Just like Washington, just like Andrew Jackson, just like Ulysses S. Grant. He is a great military leader. He will be our president one day in the 50s. When we think about the 1950s, he's our president, okay? And background information, he is the head honcho, the Supreme Allied Commander for all the Allied forces fighting the Nazis and the Italians. He's the guy who plans D-Day. Okay?
D-Day was cool. We were going to land some of us. So
oh, yeah.
We're going to go with less heavily defended.
Well, we also had Operation Dragoon, which were all these tanks and boats and stuff that were actually inflatable. But from far away, it looked like they were legit. And George Patton was in charge of that. And so you have the Nazis who were like, oh my gosh, here it is. And then as like they're getting closer, they start shooting at them and they're like, it just popped. We've been framed, you know, like.
They put them like all like to a close-up point where they thought they were going to land. They had, like thousands of those.
And there's some famous photos of them holding up, like imagine a picture of me with like one hand holding up like a tank, but it was an inflatable tank.
Didn't they also have a bunch of submarines go to get rid of the mines before D-Day?
Took definitely a long time, but do y'all see though? But we're not going to go into details about other battles yet. We'll do that Monday, okay? But I want you to understand, okay, that we've had 2 areas of fighting, okay? Make sure you know that like the turning point on the Pacific theater will be Midway, okay? And now we're going to gain islands and we're going to start doing island hopping, okay? For instance, there is the Philippines. I told you the Japanese took it from us. Well, the guy on this side will not be Eisenhower, it'll be Douglas MacArthur, okay? And he was holding down the Philippines, because remember, we own the Philippines, but then what happens, the Japanese take it over, and he's forced to evacuate. And he says a very famous quote, he says, "I shall return," okay? Well, after Midway, after a couple of this island hopping stuff, we finally get back the Philippines. And there's this very dramatic, like, filming of it, where, like, Douglas MacArthur gets off a boat, and he's in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, you know, the Philippines, and he's walking back and he's returning, okay? So there's that. And then the European theater, remember, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, the fascists just really took off all this stuff, like took over. But then D-Day, and in case you don't know, D-Day technically doesn't stand for something. A lot of people think it stands for like doomsday and stuff. In the military, when you say D-Day, it actually is like code for like departure. Okay, so this is like departure day, meaning like this is going to be day 1 of freeing the Nazis from France. You know, freeing France from the Nazis, I guess you say, and Western Europe. Okay, and you'll see after this, we're on the offensive. And like, for instance, Mussolini, he'll try to sneak out. He gets caught, and his body hung upside down in Milan Square.
Italians revolt
Mm-hmm.
against them.
Mm-hmm. They felt like it was all alive, then following them. Okay, so did we take who took notes? People who were here, did any of y'all take notes? I mean, not here, people who were online, any of y'all take notes? Okay, I'm going to show you something. Huh? You're good then, because during that time, everyone. Home. Jeremiah, Devin, and Blake, can y'all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Let me see if this thing, okay, awesome. Let's see if this thing is, here we go. So just watch this. Take maybe like, write down like 5 facts in your notes that you've already taken, and that will help. We'll finish this Monday, but this is like an active thing. I'm gonna watch it. We're gonna pause it for a little bit, okay?
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The devastating air assault on Pearl Harbor thrust the reluctant United States into a clash with the Axis powers.
The militarists of Berlin and Tokyo started this war, but the massed, angered forces of common humanity will finish it.
Battles raged around the world, in the air, on land, and at sea, to preserve the ideals of democracy.
They know that victory for us means victory for freedom.
The fate of the world was at stake.
If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age.
World War II was the most horrific conflict in human history. It spanned the globe and half a decade, and sparked political, military, and social repercussions that echoed throughout the 20th century and beyond.
will say it again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt campaigned on the promise to keep the nation out of foreign entanglements, well aware that the American voter had no taste for war. But the president and the country had cause for alarm. With each passing month, the Axis powers' tide of aggression spread, threatening to engulf the world. By the fall of 1941, Adolf Hitler's blitzkrieg had crushed resistance across Europe, leaving a wake of death and destruction. A Nazi invasion of Britain was stalled, but Hitler vowed to smash the island nation. Half a world away, in the Pacific, Japan's Minister of War, Hideki Tojo, forged a brutal reputation with a murderous invasion of Manchuria and an attack on French Indochina. On December 7, 1941, the foreign war came to America. In the space of 2 hours, a Japanese air assault on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, decimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killed nearly 2,500 servicemen. Within 3 days, the world was at war. The president braced the country for the challenges that lay ahead.
We are now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history.
Just 2 years earlier, the U.S. military was weak and the nation ill-prepared for battle. But as events overseas became increasingly ominous, the country began to rebuild its armed forces. December 7th shocked the nation into dramatic action. Remember Pearl Harbor became America's battle cry. Eager young men, anxious to fight, flocked to armed services recruiting offices. Over 5 million volunteered for duty. 10 million more were drafted during the war. After 8 weeks of basic training, these new recruits were battle-trained and ready to fight. New soldiers were given uniforms, weapons, supplies, and standard haircuts. Everything they needed was government issue. It wasn't long before soldiers themselves were being referred to as government issue or GIs.
And so that's one of those cool things, like you've heard of G.I. Joe, the toy, okay? GI stands for government issues, meaning if you were a soldier, your helmet, your food, your clothing, your shoes were all government issue, meaning government provided.
Americans from all walks of life and ethnic backgrounds signed up for the armed forces. Over 1 million African Americans served during the war, though segregation and prejudice forced them into support positions until near the end of the war. Women joined the fight too. During the war, over 250,000 women served in many roles throughout the world, such as pilots, nurses, and mechanics. As the U.S. built its fighting forces, the president called upon the nation's manufacturing might to build the implements of war needed to fight the enemy.
We shall need everything that we have and everything that our allies have to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in the coming battles on the continent of Europe and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
The U.S. mobilization for war stands among the monumental achievements in American history. In record time, the U.S. economy was completely transformed from producing peacetime goods to maximum war production. FDR established the War Production Board, the WPB, to direct the effort, and he set demanding goals.
In this year 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. We shall build 8 million tons of merchant ships.
Nationwide drives were organized to collect scrap iron and tin, rags, paper, even cooking fat to be recycled into war supplies. And metals and other raw materials were diverted for use in war production. New defense plants and shipyards sprang up seemingly overnight, and existing factories were converted to military manufacturing. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser became a national hero as his shipyards built nearly 1,500 Liberty ships. Henry Ford's massive assembly lines turned out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. And the nation's railroads made delivering raw materials and war supplies their top priority. After a decade-long depression, war production revitalized the U.S. economy. Suddenly, a nation with too few jobs had to work overtime to supply the Allied effort. As the nation's men left for the fighting front, women joined the workforce to fill.
What do you think they're about to show a picture of? There's a woman working in the factory, Rosie the Riveter.
The vacant positions. Many of them took jobs in the defense industry, making Rosie the Riveter a legend of wartime production. African Americans migrated from the rural South to work in the industrial centers of the North and West. Many were refused jobs because of race. As a result, President Roosevelt issued an executive order barring hiring discrimination in defense industries and the government, and established the Fair Employment Practice Committee to report on unfair work practices.
And remember, this committee and like where it said you cannot refuse to hire someone based off their race. So if you were like an African American and you felt like you were denied a job, like they said, because of who you are or whatever, you could make a complaint with that committee. And again, whose work and whose protesting really was successful here? A. Philip Randolph.
Opening the doors of employment for more than 2 million African Americans. By the end of the war, U.S. industry and the American worker were producing more weapons and firepower than all other nations combined. Superior technology would prove vital to defeating the enemy. President Roosevelt established the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, to bring America's leading scientists into the war effort. Many innovations developed or improved during World War II are still used today, like radar and sonar technology needed to spot enemy airplanes and submarines, and so-called miracle drugs like penicillin, which prevented the infection of battlefield wounds. Secretly, the OSRD was supervising a weapons project that would play a deciding role in the war.
Know what that weapons project was called? Manhattan Project. They are secretly building the first atomic bomb.
The creation of the first atomic bomb. The cost of war was staggering. To finance the effort, government advertisements encouraged citizens to buy war bonds.
Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor. What do they ask of us, the heroes we mourn? What do they ask of us, our marching sons across the seas? To stand shoulder to shoulder with them, here at home to do the job of forging the guns of vengeance. Bonds are our weapons. Stop on the way out. You want to say what's in your heart? Say it with bonds.
Americans responded, investing over $185 billion toward victory. Congress raised income taxes and, for the first time, deducted federal taxes from paychecks each week. To control inflation, Congress created the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, which froze the price of many goods. The OPA issued ration books, limiting the purchase of groceries, clothing, and fuel, and sending the badly needed surplus to supply Allied soldiers. Americans grew victory gardens for food. They cut back on travel and carpooled or rode bicycles to save precious gasoline. Driving alone was considered unpatriotic. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the country in many ways, but it also stirred long-standing prejudice against Japanese immigrants in America. Bowing to political pressure, President Roosevelt ordered the immediate relocation of over 110,000 Japanese Americans to remote detention camps. They were forced to abandon or sell their homes and businesses, in some cases, overnight. Many lost everything. More than 70,000 of the relocated were Nisei, Japanese Americans born in America and citizens of the U.S. Despite the unfair treatment, the interned Japanese Americans did their best to make the camps tolerable and remain loyal to the United States. Many Nisei even became U.S. soldiers. Regrettably, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans spent the entire war in detention camps.
All right, so the people who are online, if you took notes, do you want to go live and show them to me, or you can also just email them to me? Did any of y'all, people who were here, take notes?
I got names online.
All right, well, what we're going to do, just so you know, probably before lunch Monday, we're going to do a quiz over Series 19. I don't like doing quizzes on Monday, but we'll be behind. But really, all that's left that I haven't lectured about would be like the fall of Berlin and the Manhattan Project. Everything else we've talked about, and it will be a pretty easy quiz. It'll be a little different, but it should be pretty easy. So yeah, do y'all have any? Okay, hey Blake, can you show me what you did? Okay, awesome. Awesome. Gotcha. Oh, great. Okay, so just note that we will have a little quiz before lunch Monday. But you can go ahead and log off. We have 8 minutes left. You can continue to work on some things. If you want to, you can log off. It is whatever.